What happens when an avoidant meets a healed empath is rarely what people expect. It doesn't start with intensity or chaos. There's no instant obsession, no emotional overload, no late-night messages filled with desperation trying to create closeness. Instead, it begins in a strangely quiet way, almost too calm, like two people instinctively putting down their defenses at the same time without fully noticing it. The avoidant enters the connection ready for pressure. On some level, they are used to it. They expect someone who will slowly demand access to their hidden emotional world, piece by piece. At the same time, the healed empath steps in with awareness. They already understand emotional distance. They recognize hesitation hidden behind charm, the gaps between warmth and the invisible boundaries disguised as independence. But something feels different this time. The empath is no longer trying to save, fix, or rescue someone into loving them correctly. That shift is felt even if it is not understood. The emotional tone is lighter, safer. There is closeness without pressure, space without punishment, warmth without suffocation. For an avoidant, that combination feels unfamiliar, almost unreal, like standing near heat that doesn't burn. This is exactly why they linger longer than they intended. Their guard doesn't drop because they choose it to, but because it feels less necessary. And if you've ever experienced a connection like this, you know it doesn't just touch emotions, it exposes the survival patterns you thought were protecting you. Avoidants are not randomly drawn to healed empaths. It happens because the emotional chaos they are used to is missing. In past connections, they likely faced people who chased harder when distance appeared, who panicked at inconsistency, who tried to earn love through overgiving and emotional urgency. But a healed empath moves differently. Their care is steady, not demanding. Their love doesn't sound like pleading. Their questions don't feel like interrogation. Their affection isn't transactional. And most importantly, they do not collapse every time space shows up. That alone completely changes the emotional environment. Around them, the avoidant begins to relax in ways they don't usually experience. Conversations feel natural. Silence doesn't feel threatening. There is no constant pressure to define the relationship or provide reassurance. At first, the avoidant may misread this calmness as lack of interest, but it is actually something deeper. The empath does care, just without abandoning themselves in the process. That emotional balance becomes magnetic, especially because avoidants are often exhausted in ways they rarely admit. They are not addicted to distance. They are often trapped in it. They want connection, but fear what it requires from them. So when someone enters their life with warmth but no dependency, it feels like finding water after surviving in a desert while pretending they weren't thirsty. Meanwhile, the healed empath notices the avoidance patterns almost immediately, not out of fear, but from experience. They see how openness appears and disappears, how closeness increases and then suddenly retracts, how silence follows intimacy, how emotional presence comes in waves. In the past, the empath may have tried to fix this, to decode mixed signals, to wait, to understand, to give more in hopes of making someone stay. But healing changes that completely. They stop chasing potential and start observing reality. This doesn't make them cold, it makes them clear. So instead of pushing, they allow. Instead of forcing connection, they let emotional capacity reveal itself naturally. And ironically, this is what draws the avoidant closer. There is no pressure, no emotional demand, no feeling of being cornered, only presence. Slowly, the avoidant starts opening in small ways. Casual truths slip out in conversation. Old wounds appear briefly and then retreat. Personal thoughts are shared in fragments. The walls don't disappear, but they become less rigid. And the empath listens without trying to fix or control what is being revealed. That response is unfamiliar to the avoidant. They are used to emotional reactions to their vulnerability. But here, there is understanding without pressure. Then comes the phase that confuses them the most, the calm connection. No emotional games, no guilt, no chasing for validation, just steady presence with space built into it. And because the empath does not force closeness, the avoidant feels both safe and connected at the same time. That combination slowly lowers defenses built over years. They begin reaching out more often, staying present longer, and sharing more of themselves without fully realizing it. Even their body language starts to soften in ways they don't notice at first, and what unfolds from there is not intensity, but something far more unsettling for someone used to emotional chaos. Consistency that doesn't demand they lose themselves to keep it. The nervous system slowly begins to settle. For the first time, closeness doesn't feel like something that will trap them or take away their freedom. It feels like space to breathe, like something safe enough to stay inside. But right under that comfort, something else quietly starts to rise: fear. Because emotional safety doesn't just bring comfort, it brings visibility. And being seen is exactly what someone who learned to survive through emotional hiding struggles with the most. The avoidant slowly starts to realize that this person isn't just seeing the surface version of them, not the independent image they carefully maintain, not the "I'm fine" mask they've perfected. The empath is noticing what's underneath it: the quiet sadness behind distance, the loneliness hidden inside self-reliance, the fear that hides itself as "I just need space." And even though part of them feels relief, finally not having to explain everything, another part feels exposed in a way they cannot fully control. This is usually the shift point, because once they feel truly understood, something inside their nervous system starts to react. Not logically, but instinctively. The connection suddenly feels more intense, more real, more emotionally close than they are comfortable with. Avoidant patterns rarely trigger when feelings are absent. They trigger when feelings become too strong to manage safely. When caring turns into something that could lead to loss, attachment starts to feel dangerous. At the same time, the healed empath notices everything changing. The warmth drops slightly, replies become shorter, emotional presence becomes inconsistent again. The closeness that was building suddenly meets resistance, but the empath doesn't react the way they used to. They don't panic. They don't chase. They don't try to force clarity out of confusion. They stay steady. They allow space without abandoning themselves in the process. And this is where the dynamic becomes completely different from what either of them has experienced before. Because the avoidant usually expects pursuit after withdrawal. They expect the other person to chase, to over-explain, to emotionally react in a way that pulls them back in. But this time, that doesn't happen. The empath stays calm. No begging, no emotional pressure, no dramatic reactions, just awareness and self-respect. And strangely, that calmness affects the avoidant more than any emotional reaction ever could. Soon after, the avoidant begins pulling back again, sometimes even without fully understanding why. One moment, they were opening up, sharing more, feeling close. The next moment, something inside them tightens, like an alarm going off that doesn't use words, only instinct. They start needing more distance, more distraction, more control over their emotional space. They tell themselves things are moving too fast, even when nothing has really changed externally. Their responses become less warm, their emotional energy becomes inconsistent. From the outside, it can look cold or detached, but internally it is usually fear trying to protect itself by shutting things down. Because real closeness feels overwhelming for someone who built safety through emotional independence. Depending on others was never their survival strategy. Not needing anyone became their form of control. So when someone starts to matter deeply, the nervous system interprets it as risk, not comfort. The empath can feel this shift without needing it explained. The subtle withdrawal after moments of closeness, the emotional silence replacing openness, the distance forming right after intimacy. But what changes now is the empath's response. They no longer take the distance personally. They don't assume it means they are not enough. They don't start overgiving or overproving to repair the gap. They've learned something painful but freeing. Someone pulling away emotionally is not always a reflection of your worth. Sometimes it reflects their capacity to stay present. That understanding changes everything. Instead of chasing, the empath stays grounded, calm, not detached, just steady. They acknowledge the distance without falling apart inside it. And for the avoidant, this becomes unfamiliar because they are used to emotional reactions when they pull away. They are used to people chasing them, trying harder, clinging more tightly. But here, there is no chase. There is just space, quiet, stable space. And that silence begins to feel louder than conflict. The avoidant notices it. They notice the absence of pursuit. They notice the empath is no longer revolving around their inconsistency. At first, there may be relief, more space, less pressure. But underneath that relief, something else starts to appear. Unease, because people who struggle with emotional closeness often feel safest when they control distance. But when someone stops chasing and simply steps back with self-respect, it removes that control. And now they are left alone with the emotional weight of their own withdrawal. This is where the silence becomes the real turning point. Not dramatic endings, not fights, not words that break things apart. Just two people experiencing absence differently. The avoidant tries to normalize it. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They convince themselves that space is healthy and necessary. And on the surface, they may even seem fine. But emotional avoidance doesn't erase emotion. It only delays it. They wait beneath the surface, quietly building up over time. Meanwhile, the healed empath experiences silence in a completely different way than they once did. In the past, silence would have taken over their mind. They would replay conversations again and again, searching for what they did wrong, trying to decode how to become more acceptable, more lovable, more easy to stay with. Silence used to feel like punishment, but healing changes that response. Now, silence becomes information, not suffering. Instead of spiraling, they observe. Instead of abandoning themselves emotionally, they stay connected to themselves. They allow sadness to exist without turning it into self-blame. They feel the pain, but they no longer use it as a reason to collapse inward or chase validation. And this is where something important begins to shift psychologically. The avoidant often expects the empath to break the silence first, to reach out, to repair the distance, to sacrifice their own emotional stability just to restore connection. But when that doesn't happen, something uncomfortable starts building inside the avoidant. Loss. Not always the loss of the relationship itself, but the loss of emotional certainty, the loss of access, the loss of someone who understood them without forcing them to perform or over-explain. Because healed empaths leave a very specific imprint on the nervous system of someone avoidant, their presence feels safe in a way that is not easy to forget. They don't manipulate closeness. They don't turn vulnerability into pressure. They don't make love feel like emotional debt. They create warmth without emotional demand. And once someone experiences that, ordinary connections start to feel different afterward. Lighter, flatter, less emotionally grounding. The avoidant begins remembering things without meaning to. The calm conversations, the patience, the sense of being understood without interrogation, the feeling of emotional safety that didn't require constant effort. And even if they don't express it, that memory lingers. This is the part most people never see clearly. Avoidants are often deeply affected after distance forms, but they process it internally, quietly, slowly, without external expression. The absence starts showing up in small ways. A song triggers memory. A random moment brings the connection back into focus. New conversations feel less meaningful in comparison, even if they try not to admit it. But because vulnerability still feels unsafe, everything stays inside. While this is happening within the avoidant, the healed empath is going through a different kind of shift. They start to understand something they can no longer ignore. Love cannot survive on emotional potential alone. Chemistry is not the same as availability. Understanding someone deeply does not automatically make the relationship healthy or sustainable. This is one of the hardest truths for empathetic people to accept, because they naturally see what is beneath behavior. They see fear under distance, pain under detachment, wounds under inconsistency, and for a long time, that understanding can make them stay longer than they should. But healing changes that. They begin to realize that compassion for someone's wounds does not mean accepting harm in the process. You can understand someone's emotional patterns and still recognize that those patterns are hurting you. You can care deeply and still step back. And with that realization, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. Their boundaries strengthen, quietly, naturally, without aggression or announcement. They stop treating small moments of affection as enough to outweigh long periods of emotional absence. They stop confusing intensity with stability. They start valuing consistency, effort, accountability, and emotional presence more than emotional potential. And the moment this shift happens, the dynamic begins to change. The avoidant starts sensing it first, even before they fully understand it. The empath no longer feels as emotionally available in the same way. The care is still there, but it no longer feels unlimited or unconditional in the way it once did. There is still warmth, still understanding, still emotional depth, but now there is also space, clear space, protected space, and that creates something unfamiliar for the avoidant, uncertainty, because they are used to controlling emotional distance in relationships. Used to knowing when someone will return, when they will reach out, when they will overextend to reconnect. But now, that pattern is no longer guaranteed. The empath is no longer waiting in the same emotional position, no longer overreaching to close gaps created by inconsistency, no longer bending their emotional stability to maintain access, and this shift quietly destabilizes something in the avoidant. They begin to wonder, even if they don't say it out loud, whether the connection is still as available as it used to be, whether the empath is slowly detaching, whether they have already lost something they assumed would always remain accessible. And that realization often hits with a strange emotional weight, because the moment the empath stops overgiving is often the moment the avoidant starts understanding how much that emotional safety actually meant. Inside them, a conflict begins forming. One part misses the connection deeply. The calm, the understanding, the emotional ease that didn't exist elsewhere. But another part still resists what closeness requires, still fears vulnerability, still associates emotional dependence with danger. So they become split between wanting and withdrawing at the same time. And that internal contradiction creates tension they cannot easily resolve. Some try to distract themselves, some withdraw further without understanding why. Some revisit old messages, some think about reaching out, then stop before doing it. But underneath all of it, the real issue is not just fear of rejection. It is fear of being fully seen and emotionally exposed without the ability to control what comes next. Fear that if they allow themselves to love fully, they will lose the control over emotional distance that once made them feel safe. For many avoidants, that control was not just preference. It was survival long before relationships ever began. That is why these connections affect them so deeply. The healed empath unknowingly touches the emotional structure they built their life around, not through pressure, but through steady presence. And once the nervous system experiences that kind of safety, it doesn't easily forget it. At the same time, the empath faces a quieter truth. Not everyone who cares deeply is capable of loving consistently. And that realization hurts because the connection still feels real. The care still feels genuine. It just wasn't stable. Letting go becomes complicated because the empath can still sense the avoidant's inner conflict, the attachment beneath distance, the affection beneath withdrawal. Nothing feels completely fake, yet nothing is fully sustainable. But healing teaches them a hard truth. Emotional depth is not emotional readiness. Someone can care and still not stay consistent. Someone can miss you and still retreat when closeness becomes real. Someone can feel deeply and still not know how to hold it. This leads the empath into grief, not just for what ended, but for what almost existed, the version of love that never fully formed. Still, they stop abandoning themselves to keep it alive. Their energy changes. No more chasing, over-explaining, or self-erasure. They still care, but they no longer disappear inside that care. And the avoidant feels this shift even without words. The emotional certainty they relied on is no longer guaranteed. This is often where something unexpected happens, a return. Sometimes it is a memory, sometimes loneliness, sometimes comparison with emptier connections. Whatever the trigger, the avoidant feels pulled back. But now there is hesitation, because the empath no longer exists in the same emotional position. When the avoidant reaches out, it is often cautious, a small message, a soft check-in, indirect enough to avoid vulnerability. But underneath it is hope. That access still exists. When contact resumes, the avoidant expects familiarity, warmth, emotional openness, the old rhythm. Instead, they meet clarity. The healed empath is kind, but grounded, present, but no longer self-abandoning, warm, but with boundaries. And that difference is both comforting and unsettling, because they are no longer dealing with someone who tolerates emotional uncertainty endlessly. The empath speaks honestly about inconsistency, absence, and lived emotional impact. Not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity removes escape routes. There is no chaos to hide behind, only truth. And in that truth, the avoidant realizes something uncomfortable. The empath was never asking for perfection, only presence. And presence was the very thing they struggled to give. This becomes a turning point. Fantasy no longer protects them. Wrong timing or wrong person no longer fully explains it, because real change doesn't come from meeting the right person. It comes from confronting emotional avoidance itself. Healing begins when emotional distance is no longer identity, but protection. And growth starts in the moments they stop escaping discomfort, when they stay, communicate, and choose awareness over withdrawal, even when it feels uncomfortable. And that process feels terrifying because it breaks the emotional survival systems avoidants have relied on for years. Some choose to face it. They go to therapy, observe their reactions, and slowly learn to stay present when intimacy feels overwhelming instead of automatically pulling away. But others remain stuck because real change means giving up control. And for them, control was safety long before love ever existed. No matter how deep the connection is, love alone cannot replace emotional responsibility. Eventually, the healed empath understands this through experience, not theory. They realize they cannot carry two emotional journeys at once. For a long time, empaths confuse sacrifice with love. They overgive, over-explain, and try to understand someone into emotional availability. But healing brings clarity. Compassion is not sustainable when it requires self-abandonment. They begin to see their own patterns, the exhaustion, the confusion, the patience that replaced self-respect. And something changes. They stop rescuing people who are not meeting them halfway. They stop romanticizing inconsistency. They stop shrinking themselves to remain acceptable. They understand that consistency, clarity, and presence are not too much. They are the minimum. Sometimes this ends the connection quietly. No blame, just acceptance that chemistry alone cannot sustain a future. Even then, love doesn't disappear instantly. The empath may still care, the avoidant may still feel something, but without stability, one becomes drained and the other withdraws further. So, the empath leaves, not from lack of love, but from finally choosing themselves. And this leaves an imprint on the avoidant because healed empaths don't leave chaos, they leave clarity. That memory of emotional safety lingers. The avoidant may reflect, compare future connections, and wonder what was lost. Sometimes this becomes growth. They begin to face their avoidance, stay present in discomfort, and learn that closeness is not danger. The empath learns that love doesn't require self-erasure. The avoidant learns that intimacy is not loss of self. But real change only happens when both take responsibility, not when one carries the other. These relationships become mirrors. The avoidant sees their walls, the empath sees their overgiving, and whether they stay or part, both are changed. Because real love was never meant to cost you yourself. And in the end, the real shift happens when both people realize that love was never meant to be a place where one loses themselves to keep the other. It was always meant to be a space where both learn how to stay fully present without fear or self-abandonment.